Hi, thanks for joining me for my presentation for the Body Peace Conference. Fat phobia is a social justice issue. I'm Katie McCrindle, a registered social worker and fat activist and from Hamilton, Ontario, and my handle is Take Up Space Forever. So just to get started, I'd like to share this quote from Virgie Tovar, who's a prolific fat activist. She says, "My life wouldn't be easier if I were thin. My life would be easier if this culture wasn't obsessed with oppressing me because I'm fat. The solution to a problem like bigotry is not to do everything in our power to accommodate the bigotry. It is to get rid of the bigotry." And I really think that Virgie hits the nail on the head here with that quote. That fat oppression needs to be eradicated. So now I want to invite you to pause the recording for a second and take a second to think about, or maybe even write down some thoughts about how the word fat makes you feel. What were we taught to think about this word? So I'm going to just let you hit pause now. So thanks for taking the time to do that. I'd like you to reflect on your thoughts and feelings about this word as I go through the rest of the presentation. So why fat? And I first just want to say, although I came up with this list, it is informed by years of my participation in fat acceptance spaces, both online and off, both academic and personally. And a lot of people agree with the reasons why they would identify as fat, as I'm showing you here. So first of all, though, I would also like to recognize that not every person in a larger body is comfortable identifying as fat, and that people in larger bodies have experienced a significant amount of trauma and discomfort around this word, and it has been used to bully and belittle fat people. So in thinking about that, I like to say that everyone is the boss of their own underpants, which is a great concept from Reagan Chastain. And that means that, I'm a strong believer in autonomy and in respecting people's choice to identify however they want. And lots of fat activists use this word, and even people who don't consider themselves activists. They and I consider it a descriptor word like tall or short. And the word is not an inherently negative one. There's nothing bad or wrong about this word. It's just that culture has created it to be a word that we think is bad. And this word is political. So I identify as fat politically. This means that I actively work to destigmatize the word by reclaiming it. It's become a part of my identity. And I believe that calling myself fat and living in the world as a fat person is inherently political, in that my perceived difference, in that difference, my body becomes a site of public contestation. So simply existing becomes a radical act, especially existing without apology and without seeking intentional weight loss. And I use the word fat rather than obese or overweight to signify my rejection of those medicalized terms, which have been used to pathologize me and justify my oppression. And the risks associated with obesity have been exaggerated. In fact, studies have found that weight cycling and the stress associated with living in a marginalized body and experiencing oppression are contributing factors for many health issues that are traditionally associated with obesity. Now I'd like to move on to talking about the roots of fat acceptance. So where did this thing come from? Well, I have located it in three main events. So the first being the Fat In, which took place in New York City Central Park on June 3rd, 1967. And essentially this was a protest against fat hatred. So 500 people, all different sizes, came together. They used clothing as a way to just express their disdain for weight loss. Things like wearing horizontal stripes, wearing really tight clothes, wearing belts that were tape measures. They came with signs and slogans. For example, they had a slogan, "Fat Power," or "Buddha was fat." And they ate forbidden junk food together. And this whole event culminated in burning a life-size photograph of the model Twiggy, who was symbolic of thinness being upheld as above all else. Secondly, was the creation of NAFA, the National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance, which was established in 1969 and still exists today. It was established by a man named Bill Fabre, who was inspired by article called "More People Should Be Fat" by Llewellyn Louderback, who later went on to author the book Fat Power. Bill was a self-identified fat admirer and married to a fat woman, and he was astonished and dismayed by the treatment of fat people, which was the catalyst to starting this organization. And then lastly, the Fat Underground was established in 1972 and unfortunately is now disbanded. This was a more radical group and really the foundation of fat acceptance as we know it today. And Fat Underground, or FU, was, quote, feminist in perspective. It asserted that American culture fears fat because it fears powerful women, particularly their sensuality and their sexuality. So it was created by Sarah Golda Braca Fishman, whose quote that was, and another person named Judy Free Spirit, and they met in the Radical Feminist Therapy Collective in LA. And they were part of this group and sort of came together one day wanting to represent this group in a rally, but the other radical therapists didn't want them to because they were both overweight, and they didn't want their group to be seen as represented by two fat people. So this experience and reading Louderback's article, as well as experiencing marginalization and oppression as fat people, had them inspired to join NAFA and start a local chapter. But eventually they split from NAFA because NAFA felt their approach was too confrontational and rejected their feminist ideology. So this group was the first to theorize fat oppression and even has a fat liberation manifesto. So fat acceptance today, I just want to again say this is my definition that I've kind of hobbled together. This movement is extremely heterogeneous. There's lots of different people in it, and others might define this differently. But when I'm looking at fat acceptance, I think that if we're not centering the bodies that face the most discrimination due to their size, then we're doing a disservice to social justice. And those bodies, in terms of size, are the super or infinite fat bodies, the bodies at the fattest end of the spectrum. If the world was accessible and welcoming to these bodies, then it would automatically be for the rest of us. So that's where the social justice piece comes in. And fat acceptance, unlike body positivity, recognizes that beauty is a social and cultural construct, which is grounded in patriarchal and capitalist ideas. And a great quote I like to use from Stephen Colbert is that, quote, "If girls feel good about themselves, how are we going to sell them things they don't need?" So fat acceptance is, instead of being focused on beauty, is focused on breaking down oppressive systems so that fat people can get access to medical, social, employment opportunities, and more. Having gone in a little bit to what fat acceptance is, I just wanted to briefly cover body positivity. So body positivity arose from the work of fat activists that I've mentioned and others, and it was popularized as a term back in the 90s and moved into the mainstream consciousness probably within the last 5, 10, 20 years due to the popularity of the internet and social media. And although body positivity was initially created to center people in marginalized bodies, fat people, women of color, disabled people, people with various gender identities, it has shifted. But the main message is, love the body you're in. There's nothing wrong with your body. You're enough. There's nothing you need to change or fix, which absolutely is a great message for anyone in any body. But the body positivity movement has lost its focus on marginalized bodies and has been co-opted by those with a high degree of body privilege, those who are white, thin, cis, non-disabled, and most of all, mostly women. And so in this co-optation, there's been a lack of recognition and credit given to those who work so hard so that the body positivity movement could gain mainstream recognition. And furthermore, there's been commercialization of body positivity to sell products, particularly by the diet industry. So what is fat phobia? Well, fat phobia is not as widely accepted as a legitimate oppression as many others are. But just like any other oppression, fat phobia can be enacted on an individual or systemic level. And systemically, fat phobia impacts people who are perceived to be larger than what is socially acceptable. And this operates by impeding their access to educational and employment opportunities, medical care, social opportunities, actual spaces like seating in a range of public venues and transportation. And due to fat phobia impacting those in larger bodies in this way, these issues become not just an individual stressor, but a human rights violation and therefore a social justice issue. Fat phobia is rooted in white supremacy. Sabrina Strings wrote an excellent recent book which outlines how the roots of fat phobia have been traced to the transatlantic slave trade and Protestantism. Colonists and scientists found evidence that Black people were sensuous and therefore prone to sexual and oral excess. And meanwhile, Protestantism encouraged control and temperance of pleasure. So you can see where they were a bit at odds there. And fat phobia harms not just fat people, but everyone. It impacts those in any size body because people are either fat and dealing with the repercussions of oppression, or they're thin and they live in fear of becoming fat and facing these same consequences. And furthermore, since people believe that thin equals healthy 100% of the time, there are assumptions made regarding thin bodies which have the potential to impact their health or have them not receive care. And why is this important to eating disorder recovery spaces? Well, because fat phobia and diet culture perpetuates eating disorders. Now, I'm not saying that they're the sole cause, and obviously as people watching this, you will know that. But they're a contributing factor, and systems of thought that serve to uphold and reinforce this kind of thinking go along with eating disorders. So what do we do about fat phobia? Well, these are my suggestions. Diversify your social media feeds. This is a big one. Follow people whose bodies are different than yours, especially if you live in a culturally acceptable body. And if you do live in a marginalized body, follow more people whose bodies look like yours, and other bodies, right? The more people you can follow that are different from what we see in dominant social media, the better. And unfollow anyone who makes you feel bad about your body. Secondly, start to challenge your own fat phobia and then challenge other people's. So notice where you're fat phobic towards yourself and ask yourself why and where is this coming from? And once you're comfortable with that, start challenging other people's fat phobia. Set boundaries with people around how much diet culture you're willing to accept. The third one is practice body appreciation. So gratitude lists are always such a great idea in my opinion. Start one about your body. What can your body do today? Exactly the size you are now. And what did your body do for you today? Maybe list those things. 4 would be to seek to dismantle structural fat phobia. This is a big one. It's a lot of work. There's a lot of people working on this, but the more people, the better. So work towards dismantling fat phobia, which is built into the systems that exist. Just like racism, just like heterosexism, just like ableism, all of these things are built into our systems, and we need to work towards undoing that. So do things like supporting the movement around to get size and appearance added as a protected right in the Human Rights Code. If you look up hashtag sizeism sucks and Jill Andrew, you'll know what I'm talking about. And Jill's going to be one of the keynotes at this conference. Definitely check her out. Also, stand up against weight loss challenges in your workplace. You know, do what you can personally do to interrupt those systemic fat phobia, the systemic fat phobia that's happening. And then lastly, I just wanted to talk about body liberation. Now, body liberation, or maybe fat liberation, this is kind of a new alternative approach to body positivity. It's one that I think encompasses a social justice lens and emphasizes the intersectional nature of our identities. And for me, this term includes fat acceptance, but it also includes any other bodies of any kind of marginalized identity. So I just want to leave you, I just want to read this quote from Jess Baker, which I think really encapsulates body liberation. So, liberation is freedom from all outside expectations, even our own. Liberation is not having to love your body all the time. Liberation is not asking permission to be included in society's ideal of beauty. Liberation is bucking the concept of beauty as currency altogether. Liberation is recognizing the systemic issues that surround us and acknowledging that perhaps we're not able to fix them all on our own. Liberation is personally giving ourselves permission to live life. So I just want to come back at the end of this presentation to ask, how do you feel about the word fat now? Have your thoughts changed? If so, how? If not, why do you think that is? I invite you to pause now and think about or write down how you feel about the word fat after having listened to this presentation. Thanks for taking the time to pause there. So I just want to end by saying thank you so much for choosing to watch this presentation as part of your Body Peace Conference experience. You can reach me on Facebook and Instagram, and there's my email. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much. And I'm just going to leave you with the last slide, which was my references.